Hello and welcome to a new episode on the Wars Rebellion podcast for Age Soul War. Today from misty, rainy North Germany with a newborn in the house. And here I am today with my partner in crime for this series on perspectives from historians, Andrew Hauk, who is coming to us from what looks a little overcast but much nicer there in central France.
Eh, cloudy,
Eh,
kind of cold, not like where you are, but
It was cold too, but yeah, it's miserable right now. Now, we did the Civil War Talk Radio imitation. We would spend probably the next 20 minutes talking about Auburn football, but we're going to spare you that because we are going to head over to Alabama and head north of I-85 in Montgomery, where our guest for today is in his office. So we have Ben Severance with us today, who should start at the very first part of his biography, was a lieutenant in the U.S. Army with the Chemical Corps. Maybe you can explain that to us in a little bit. He has a Master's of Arts from Clemson University, a PhD from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Yes, unfortunately. And he's now living in the great state of Alabama at the at Auburn University, Montgomery. He is here with us today because we're going to talk about some of his book and his oldest one, if we can say that in sort of a family sense. His oldest one, which is Tennessee's Radical Army, 2005, but he also more recently has published a war state all over Alabama politics and the Confederate cause. So, Ben, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'll hand it over to Andrew because he has been giddy all week to talk to Ben.
it's true. I'd say more than a week because you and I have talked about this for a long time, uh, talking with Ben. Um, so hi, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction. Looking forward to talking about my oldest book.
Your oldest book. Well, what is you were in the
The
army?
Chemical Corps.
Yes.
I was in the Army from I got an ROTC commission out of the University of Washington, my undergraduate, and went into the U.S. Army, was commissioned, and was assigned to the Chemical Corps. This is a branch of the military that trains and prepares for the eventuality of a combat environment where there could be nuclear weapons used, chemical weapons used, or biological weapons used. But it's collectively called the Chemical Corps. So even though I was a history major and continue to focus on history, the Army decided that the best place to utilize my skills was in a field I didn't know anything about. Radiation, poison gas, and all that sort of thing. But it was a rewarding experience, and I met a lot of good people in the Army. But I served my 4 years, and then graduate school beckoned, and so I resigned my commission. But yeah, I was in the Chemical Corps. It's an obscure branch of the U.S. military, but one that's still around, and hopefully one that never really sees a lot of action, because that's
That's
the
right. Yeah.
that's the kind of warfare. Nobody likes war, but that's warfare. That's the worst of it all.
That's dirty war. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Mm. So,
LinkedIn is great.
Much better to have high explosives and rifle fire and all that.
so speaking of war, your okay. So this is when I show the book for the people who haven't. What is this? The picture. What is this?
It's in the
It's
book
a
itself. There's a photograph of William J. Smith. He was a one of the radical Republicans in Tennessee who strongly supported the creation of the State Guard and helped move the Militia Act through the state legislature. That photograph focuses in on his gauntlet and his sword. He was an immigrant from England, and then fought on the Union side, and then moved to well, he was actually in Tennessee before the war began, and was a Unionist, and fought in the Federal Army during the Civil War. And then afterwards, he became a radical Republican and an ally of the Republican administration in the state. So he was a military man in the war, but he's a politician during Reconstruction itself. But he's always a reliable radical Republican in the state legislature.
And I think we should circle back to that, the kind of the blending of the political and the military after, because it'll be a good segue into talking about the role of the Tennessee State Guard. What was the can you kind of give an overview of this subject, because the topic is obscure enough that I don't know if many people know about it, and I don't know what well, it's a pretty obscure topic. It's an important topic. It's an interesting aspect, it's an important aspect of Reconstruction that's not very well known, and I think it should be. Can you talk about it a little bit and explain what Tennessee was like during Reconstruction, where this idea for the Tennessee State Guards came from?
Well, Tennessee, it was officially a Confederate state, but at least a third of the population, most of it from the eastern part of the state and the mountain counties, were stridently opposed to the Confederacy and resisted secession. And when Tennessee formally joins the Confederacy, about 30,000 Tennesseans joined the Union Army. There was a lot of guerrilla strife and warfare in Tennessee, and lots of Tennesseans fought for the Union side. That's an aspect that's often overlooked. That Tennessee's, it's gray, so it must be hardcore. When in fact it's very divided in its loyalties. And when the war comes to an end, the Unionist minority, a pretty sizable minority, is determined to regain control politically in the state to make sure that the ex-Confederates and the secessionist mindset does not hold sway at the state and local level. And we'll talk about Governor Brownlow. He's the principal leader of the Republican movement. Well, these Unionists, they joined the Republican Party because the Republican Party, that's the party of Abraham Lincoln, the party of the victorious North that waged the war and crushed the Confederacy. And so, most of these Unionists end up becoming Republicans. But in order to politically establish themselves, and you have to throw in there the fact that emancipation's taken place, and so you have the whole racial question that's gonna enter the story as well. These Republicans, they need a reliable law enforcing body to help them enforce laws, protect the rights not only of themselves but of the freedmen, and to keep the ex-Confederate um, rebellious mindset at bay. So this is the germination of a militia system to create, and the Tennessee State Guard, the rank and file. Most of them are Unionists. They are Republicans. I rightly call it a partisan military organization because it's designed to serve the needs and interests of the Republican Party and to promote the Reconstruction agenda. It's not a cross section of Tennesseans.
No. Yeah.
It's very anti-Confederate.
Well, that's exactly right. And it makes sense. I mean, what I really you in your introduction, we talked about this earlier before we started recording. Your introduction is short, but it's very to the point, and it opens up a lot of these major questions, and it also defines your terms. So when you're talking about Unionists, you use the term radicals.
Yeah, the terminology is important to clarify things, and I was a little too loose in my previous statement about unionists because within the unionist element there is division. The movers and shakers in the first couple of years of Reconstruction in Tennessee, they're the radicals. The Unionists joined the Republican Party, but there's the radical wing of the Republican Party, and that's what the Tennessee State Guard is comprised of. That's why it's called Tennessee's Radical Army,
Yeah.
the title of the book, because not all the radicals in Tennessee, they want to punitively subjugate the ex-Confederates, whom they view as traitors, who
Mm.
have plunged their state into misery. They don't want them to have political power, so they pass laws disfranchising them. But they also are willing to promote African American rights with some qualifications.
Of course.
They're white supremacists, and some of the laws they pass on behalf of freedmen are done out of expediency as much out of any kind of egalitarian sense of doing the right thing.
Mm.
But this is the main core that wants to promote a hard reconstruction. Then there's the conservative unionists who oscillate between uh, promoting Reconstruction and perhaps just trying to forgive and forget and move on. And then there's the ex-Confederate majority. And I use a term in my book, anti-radical, which
Yeah.
is a little clumsy, but it's a way of combining the conservative unionists who are not thrilled by the harsh extreme measures that the radical wing wants to implement, and then the ex-Confederates, who of course are totally opposed to everything about Reconstruction and resist it at every turn. Um, there's times where I talk about each one separately, but then I'll collectively refer to them as the anti-radicals. Whereas the radicals, they're a white unionist hardcore minority, but they'll also include the freedmen. Once the African Americans get the right to vote, African Americans will join the Republican Party and they'll side with the radical because the radicals are between the two political factions. The radicals offer African Americans something, the other side offers them nothing.
Yeah. Well, and then that also, I think, does a very good job of kind of explaining the, the complexities of Civil War era Tennessee. Um,
The complexity could be found across the South. Tennessee is one, as a microcosm of Reconstruction. I've said it in other venues that you've really got 11 Reconstructions going on, one for each Confederate state. There's Reconstruction, there's the broad term of what's going on in the South, and then when you look at individual states, you'll see different dynamics at work, and that's a lot of that's a function of comes down to race ratios. The states that have lots of African Americans are going to experience a different Reconstruction than those that without so many. And also the levels of unionism.
yeah,
White unionism is much more pronounced in the upper South, places like Tennessee, parts of Arkansas. Um, and when you get to the deep South, the unionist force, the unionist element is minuscule by comparison. So you get different stories, different phenomenons in all of the Confederate states, former Confederate states.
so in what ways that, I'm sorry, Niels, I'm just kind of dominating this conversation.
I have my question ready for the next one.
Are you sure? Are you sure? Okay.
You could.
Well, I was going to say, so in what way, no, I forgot the question. Go ahead, Niels. Go ahead, Niels.
That's all right. It's actually perfect to kind of go in and where you kind of, especially in our correspondence where we talked about like how we wanted to bring you on and kind of frames the conversation. I kind of, on Andrews's urging, I actually did a little digging this afternoon about this too, and it was interesting, right? Like where you kind of mentioned earlier, you kind of go to the book and kind of see did you get cited or not, and like I did a quick check, and like Jeremy Surrey and his atrocity on Reconstruction, he does not cite you. Unfortunately, I also looked like Mark Summers in his ordeal of Reconstruction does not cite you for some reason. But I found it very interesting that John Daly's A War After the War, that new history about Reconstruction and sort of this Civil War, yeah, Southern Civil War context, does cite you, and he notes that your book, besides Budansky's The Bloody Shirt and Lemarine's Redemption, stands out as excellent works on state history. So I kind of thought that was a great kind of way to think about it, right? So you have some of these really big Reconstruction books that become so, I guess, overwhelming because of the amount of coverage they have to give to all these 11 different reconstruction processes that they forget that
Mm.
certain states like Tennessee have a very important contribution to make.
Yeah, the big studies of Reconstruction are worthy. The topic's worthy. But and so there has to be an element of forgiveness when you get down. They can't cover everything. I mean, I'm always honored when and flattered even when somebody when it does cite my work. It's gratifying that the hard work and research I put into it wasn't just sent out into a black hole somewhere. But all scholars have to make decisions about the aspects they're going to cover, and certainly those broad histories of Reconstruction. There's only so much you can do when you want to get down to the minutia. That's why state studies are important to help flesh out the story. That and when you go from the macro to the micro,
Hmm.
it's a different perspective, and that's what uh, drew me to this topic, to the Tennessee State Guard, when I was at the University of Tennessee doing my research under Stephen Ash, a great Civil War historian, recently passed away. He was a wonderful mentor to me. Um, when I was looking at the Tennessee story, the State Guard aspect was only marginally covered in some of the early state histories. And I thought, this seems to be a disservice because in order for Reconstruction to work, there's lots of new laws and policies being put into place that are very controversial and are encountering all kinds of pushback from the defeated majority, the ex-Confederates. You need something that can enforce these laws and make people obey and perhaps even
Yeah.
submit. And that's the Tennessee State Guard. And nothing had been done on that. And I went to the in Nashville, the archives in the Capitol, and found just reams of microfilm from the Adjutant General's office that laid out all of the details of the State Guard, and nobody had ever done anything with that. And that's the bulk of my primary source research comes from the files of the Tennessee Adjutant General's office. Just wonderful
Mm.
reports from these company commanders that were in the field trying to enforce Reconstruction policies. Um, and and it also, I was drawn to the topic because for me, the main theme of Reconstruction is violence.
Mhm.
It is a continuation of the Civil War. I'll
Mm.
tell my students when I teach the Civil War, you've got the traditional dates, 1861 to 1865. Battle of Bull Run and then Appomattox, Lee surrenders, and the whole thing's supposedly finished, when in fact the militancy, the belligerence, it just continues on for many years thereafter. And that's what Reconstruction is. It's a paramilitary power struggle between the defeated and who comprise a majority of the South, and those that want to kind of redefine and restructure, reconstruct the politics, the economics, and the society. And you need a military body that can help make that happen, and that's the State Guard.
A military body other than the federal government for
Right.
supplying troops and yeah.
Yeah, that's a point I bring up as well. Well, first of all, the Tennessee State Guard, it it it's it has two deployments, one in 1867, another in 1869, and it's made up of almost 2,000 men each time. Many of them are veterans of the war, so they're reliable law enforcers for the radical Republican government. But you mentioned the federal garrison. There are U.S. Army troops in the state, and oftentimes Governor Brownlow, the leader in Tennessee, and then other states will often call on the federal garrison, U.S. troops, to do all the law enforcing. One, it's free. You don't have to pay for the federal garrison. The Tennessee State Guard becomes pretty expensive
Mm.
as the deployment unfolds, and the hope is that the soldiers will be respected. When they show up, there's not going to be any violence. The problem is that the U.S. military uh, has is demobilizing. The U.S. Army really does not want to engage in Reconstruction counterinsurgency operations. Most of them want to go out and fight Indians, or Phil Sheridan, if you're familiar with him, he was really kind of hoping a war might break out with the French troops in Mexico, and he could go down there and kick some ass on the French. He didn't want to muck around with Reconstruction politics. So the U.S. Army it has garrisons in various parts of the South, but it is really loath to get involved in state affairs, and the jurisdiction oftentimes is
Yeah.
is a little questionable. And then at the county level, there was also a lot of these governors were hoping that the sheriffs might be able to maintain law and order. But the problem with local county sheriffs is a lot of times they were members of the insurgency, later
Mhm.
the Ku Klux Klan, or even if they weren't, they don't have the resources to do anything. They could find themselves getting killed if they tried to protect African Americans or punish ex-Confederates who were trying to mess up on voting day at the polling precincts. So the militia becomes that crucial linchpin to enforcing Reconstruction policy. It's at the beck and call of the governor, unlike the federal garrison, and it has the firepower and the discipline and the numbers that can actually get something done, unlike the local county sheriffs. And so
Mm.
I try to make the case that if Reconstruction is going to work, um, you're going to need a reliable militia force to make it happen.
Well, I was thinking as you were talking that considering your book came out in 2005 and like we're about 20 years on from it almost.
Pretty close to 20 years on.
Yeah, like
Yeah,
by the time it gets
19, just
published,
19.
we're 10 days away from it.
That's
So,
right.
but when we think of it, right, like it's 9 years after that you get Egerton's Wars of Reconstruction, and then it's another uh I forget when Daly's book came out of Wars After the War
Yeah.
After the Wars. Right? So it's like you kind of sets the stage for these later books that take a bigger scope, that Reconstruction is an internal conflict within the southern states. It is something of a civil war. So
Yeah.
I kind of wondered if kind of do you see yourself as sort of the with your work and others that have done state studies as sort of pushing the kind of narrative of Reconstruction in sort of that direction, or did it surprise you when Egerton and Daly kind of made this sort of like, oh, this is a civil war in a civil in the South during this period?
it it was affirming to see that. I wouldn't necessarily call myself the prophet of you know violence is the leitmotif of Reconstruction. But I'm certainly part of a growing cluster of historians that view it that way,
Mm.
as a continuation of the Civil War,
Mm,
as a very violent uh, time, complicated political story that is anchored to the Civil War,
mm,
but is not as dramatic as the battles of Gettysburg or
mm,
Fredericksburg or Shiloh. Instead, it's a lot of low key, low level intensity skirmishing and bushwhacking, and just a constant simmering of
mm,
of clashes between the victors and the vanquished. And so I'm part of that school of thought, and I'm also part of a school of thought that is reevaluating Reconstruction in the sense of while it's often referred to as a failure, it was also a time of hope.
Mm.
You have to decide what perspective are you looking at. There's the old what was called the Dunning School, and I don't want to get
Yeah.
into William Dunning,
Oh, why
1900, where
not?
Yeah, we should. We
right,
need
okay,
to, I think.
he was one of the he and his students were part of an early school of thought that presented Reconstruction as this tragic disaster that was, needlessly punitive toward the defeated South and was elevating African Americans to citizenship for which they weren't ready, and that you needed the old planter class to kind of paternalistically guide them along, and it was a foolish experiment, and a big power grab on the part of a bunch of scoundrelly carpetbag Northerners who wanted to come down and take advantage of the situation. That's an old interpretation that's gone through a whole series of revisions. When you get to the civil rights era, 1950s and 1960s, you start seeing new studies that try to put
Terrence
things.
Stamp and others. Yeah.
Yeah, Stamp and John
Um,
Hope Franklin.
Kenneth Stamp, not Terrence. Terrence Stamp is is
No,
an actor.
no, Terry
Kenneth
Sipe.
Stamp.
Um, he covers it as well. But yeah, they're
Okay, that's
they're
good.
they're turning it around and saying, well, let's look at this from the perspective of African Americans. And so Reconstruction becomes a time of hope uh, for African Americans to become members of a biracial democracy. You got one of the books there?
Oh,
Okay. Yeah.
okay.
Yes.
Boners, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. If there's a single, what's that one? Another, yeah. Okay, I'll grab my copy off my shelf too. But yeah, yeah, 1988, Foner comes out with sort of what for the moment was the definitive study where he is trying to denounce the old Dunning School,
Hmm.
Mm,
elevate the role of African Americans, and portray the Republican Party's efforts in a more heroic light,
Hmm.
without reducing history to heroes and villains,
yeah.
which is never the right way to go. Um, seeing Reconstruction again is a time of hope, and it's a noble experiment, something to where again you've got 4 million African Americans were slaves who are now free. How do you integrate them into American society while at the same time quelling the enduring rebellious mindset of the ex-Confederates,
Hmm.
which never goes away, which makes Reconstruction so complicated. Is most white Southerners psychologically cannot come to grips with the fact that a race of former slaves are now equal to them. This is from our standpoint today. I'd like to think that we all, can see. Accept racial equality. There's some lunatics out there that still don't think that way, but from in the context of 1865, when the war comes to an end, it's really unreasonable to think that the majority of white Southerners are going to happily embrace racial egalitarianism. So you have to pretty much foist that onto Southern society, which is a big part of the Reconstruction story. And in order to make that happen, you're gonna have to resort to the politics of force. You're gonna have to make people accept this reality.
Mm. Well, you talk about the it's a long history of Reconstruction. Um, and you talk about the Civil War itself being, we have these dates, Fort Sumter to Appomattox, and then after that you have Reconstruction, and supposedly Reconstruction ends in 1877. Uh, does the violence end then too? Is everything hunky dory after 1877? When does Reconstruction actually end? Because then you have the memory of Reconstruction that comes into play with Dunning, and that goes until so.
I see we should just focus on Tennessee because otherwise he's going to go through 11
The,
states and each
the,
each has its
No,
own
no, but I mean,
story.
but
well,
no,
18, I mean, with Tennessee, that Reconstruction, at least politically, ends pretty much in 1870,
yeah,
with the fall of the radical Republican government. The Democrats, ex-Confederates, regain control and begin dismantling the whole thing. And then but we were talking about 11 different reconstructions. It's still going on elsewhere. The 1877 date pertains to South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. Those are the last three states where the
Officially.
Republicans are finally ousted from power. And that word ousted, we were talking about various historians. Alan Gelzo wrote a really concise history of Reconstruction among his many works. And it came years after I wrote my book, but it resonated with me when in his conclusion he said, Reconstruction didn't fail, it was overthrown. And
Mm,
I like that characterization, and it dovetails with my own work that
Mm.
uh,
mm,
you can call Reconstruction a failure. The promise is never fully realized, but it was overthrown by a paramilitary insurgency, which
mm,
included at various times the Ku Klux Klan, which was able to overpower these Republican administrations
mm,
in large part because the militia system was disbanded. In my book, I argue that when the militia is active, the Reconstruction process is working. It may
mm,
not be working to the satisfaction of the ex-Confederate majority, but it is working and gaining results. But when the militia is disbanded for reasons of cost and fears of race war and concerns about political legitimacy, the ex-Confederates very quickly are able to outmaneuver politically
Mm.
the Republican administrations.
Now, I'm gonna because in the way you were talking about it, it very much sort of resonates with modern topics, right? Like January 6th, a violent attempt to kind of prevent the certification of the election in 2021. So considering he you're one of the very few Reconstruction era historians, and as we talked before we started the recording, there's not a lot of books published on Reconstruction. There's very few popular books, right, that reach sort of a general audience, and the one that just came out was Jerry Suri's and atrocity and the way it steps back in time was a lot of the narrative strains, apparently. So I'm kind of wondering, like, why isn't Reconstruction more popular, right? It speaks to so many contemporary themes and issues with regard to like race, but then also sort of like conflicts of power, constant struggles with violence, right? It's a modern subject matter, if you want, and more so than the American Civil War, which is sort of an
Mm.
oddity considering we usually don't fight each other on battlefields. It's more like what we see during Reconstruction, these microaggressions, these small scale engagements like murders here and there, lynchings, intimidation. That's more common. So I kind of wonder why do you think it's Reconstruction isn't like more popular?
Well, I think part of it is what you're talking about is the kind of the disorganized, amorphous nature of the violence. Violence is always an attractive topic. People love, people don't like to experience conflict, but they like to read about it and see it on TV and that sort of thing. It's fascinating, and Reconstruction's filled with that, but it it doesn't have a linear quality to it.
Mm.
The Civil War, you can see the progress of the armies. You've got these famous battles. You've got these
Mm,
heroic charges. One can ensconce it all in glory, while setting aside the carnage of it all. That has that's easier to follow the progression.
mm,
Whereas with Reconstruction, because it's 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 lawlessness intermixed with political struggles to get policies implemented, it becomes confusing.
Mm.
And I think for your average reader, your average citizen, um, it's hard to follow what's going on.
So
Um,
Ca-
yeah, go
Can I
ahead.
ju- can I jump on that?
mm,
Sure.
Niels and I were talking about this as well. I've read this book. I think I've read it 3 times, and I've gone through it a fourth for this conversation. The first time I read it, I mean, obviously I like it a lot, of course. Um, just the first time I read it though, I realized that was underwater. I had no idea. I wasn't able to follow my knowledge of Reconstruction era Tennessee was not uh, sophisticated enough to follow the complexities of the story that you were telling. It is confusing. And my question, one of my initial questions for you, was actually, who were you writing this book for? I mean, obviously it was your thesis. Um, who do you see as the audience today for this book in particular?
Well, you're right. It does have a strong academic feel to it, and it was my dissertation. So the main drive was to get the doctorate at the end of the product.
Mm.
And then when I pushed for publication, uh, I was hoping to share with whoever wanted to read it, the audience out there, the Reconstruction story is an important adjunct to the Civil War story,
Mm.
and that Tennessee, which if you go in parts of East Tennessee now, where most of the state guardsmen come from Knoxville and Chattanooga and the mountain counties, you'll see a lot of Confederate flags there. And before I came to Montgomery, I taught a couple Civil War courses as an adjunct professor at University of Tennessee, and I was just astounded at by how so many of the students were unaware of the strong unionist element and the heavy radical Republican administration. To them, East Tennessee was just like Middle and West Tennessee. They were all
Confederate?
Confederates. They're not, and that so there was an element of history had just been lost that people growing up in East Tennessee, that most of their ancestors were probably Unionists who were opposed to the Confederacy, and yet they've got this neo-Confederate mindset.
Mm.
And so, I don't want to overgeneralize. There are East Tennesseans who are aware of the real history, but it was partly to educate the local community that I was um, getting my own education in, um, but just to step into the Reconstruction story, like you're saying, not a lot's written about it. I wanted to make a contribution that would draw attention to this important period and emphasize the the struggles that Tennessee was going through, and then by extension, the rest of the South. Um, I you know I'm on the pro Reconstruction side of things. If you read the book,
Yeah.
I'm trying to be objective about it, but anyone that reads it, 4 times, like you have, Andrew, now you'll see that
Yeah.
I'm pretty sympathetic to
Yeah.
the radical cause here, because they're trying to defend the
Mm.
rights of the newly freed African Americans, which is a laudable thing to do. Yes, if you interviewed all of these state guardsmen, a lot of them would have racist attitudes toward African Americans. To them, giving blacks the right to vote was an expedient, but they also accepted the article of faith that was the Union, and that the ex-Confederates had tried to destroy the legacy of the American Revolution and had plunged their state into a needless and bloody conflict, and it was time to redress the political equation.
Mm.
And so they protect African Americans. They protect the voting process. They help build up the Republican Party apparatus in the state, and they do their best to suppress ex-Confederate lawlessness that is persistent and relentless and will not compromise. It's a mindset that we have to remember that the Civil War, an expression, may perhaps flying all over the place at this point,
No, you're
but
good. You're good.
there's an
I love
expression
it.
about the Civil War where they say it's a brother's war, brother versus brother. I've never really liked that expression. Yes, there are times where a brother is on one side and the brother is on the other, uh, but it makes it sound like some sort of tragic family discord. No, the Confederates hate the guts out of the Yankee North, and the feeling is mutual. And when African Americans get the right to vote, this is the world turned upside down for ex-Confederate Southerners. This is a nightmare scenario for them. There is no brother versus brother. There's genuine enmity that persists. Appomattox is a misleading moment where Lee and Grant shake hands, and you get this very generous peace terms that Grant allows the Army of Northern Virginia. And when you conclude there, you're missing the fact that the animosities are deep and profound and carry over. There, this is the two cultures despise one another, and in a microcosmic level, Unionists in Tennessee, certainly the radical ones, they've got serious hatred for the toward the ex-Confederates and vice versa, and this fuels the violence. To the credit of the State Guard, they're disciplined. And the General Cooper who runs it tries to make it as professional as possible. And an argument I make is even though you've got this enmity between the two sides, the State Guard conducts itself with restraint, with discipline. It follows proper rules of engagement. This isn't just okay,
Babble.
the Klan lynched some people, so we're going to go and slaughter one of their villages.
Mhm.
Nothing like that's happening here. There is an effort to contain ex-Confederate violence, but to do so within the letter of the law as much as possible. And
Yeah.
uh, hard order to enforce and maintain because a lot of these members of the State Guard, they remember hunting down Confederate rebels and guerrilla bands and seeing the atrocities and the temptation to get revenge is highly pronounced, but they keep it in check for the sake of trying to make the Reconstruction process work and garner legitimacy. That's
Mhm.
an important goal. What an advantage the rebels have, the ex-Confederates, is they don't have to worry about legitimacy. What they want to do is disrupt and undermine the Republican governments. The Republican governments, conversely, have to establish political legitimacy, which means they have to exercise restraint in their own use of force. And that further complicates the political story because they're brand new governments. If they start moving around and slaughtering rebel households, they're going to lose all credibility. The federal garrison is going to turn against them, and they're going to lose the support to the extent that there is any of Northern sympathies for the whole Reconstruction process. That was a lot. I went on there with a lot of run-on sentences there.
There are a lot of things that I was thinking about when you were talking, and I'm just gonna think about one aspect that where the Brother War, right? Like I remember when I was teaching my U.S. survey from a public history perspective, one of the first lessons I did was on Disney and Disney's misconstruction of history, and I always brought up um, in Epcot, the American Adventure. And in that, the way they introduce the American Civil War is a family portrait with the two brothers arguing against each other. And the entire war is then construed and presented as this brother war, which is like, ah, like it's terrible, right? But as you were talking, I was actually thinking about something else too, and this might be way off topic for you to kind of even have encountered or thought about. But there's, like you said, there's this animosity, that hatred between the Union elements, U.S. elements, and the Confederate rebel elements in the entire country, but Tennessee as well. And it's of course somewhat ironic when we think of that our first national military park designed for reconciliation is right on the border with Tennessee and Georgia, right at Chattanooga, Chickamauga. So in part, I'm kind of thinking here, how did these old unionists feel about it that there's suddenly this effort in the late 1890 or mid 1890s, I should
Yeah.
say, to reconcile? Like, I mean, especially in their own backyard, right? It's one of the most vicious areas of animosity, Tennessee, and here we want to make an example and say, let's shake hands and be all friends
Well,
again.
And just on that note, at Chickamauga, there are four Tennessee Unionist monuments.
I don't
No,
remember.
I don't.
They could be.
I
I
don't
think
know the number.
there are at least a few Tennessee Unionist monuments. There's a federal a cavalry monument. There's an infantry monument to Tennessee troops, for federal troops from Tennessee at Chickamauga.
Hmm.
So even in 1900, they were already beginning to uh, look back and remember the unionism, or the Tennessee unionism
Right.
at that period of genesis of the National Park Service.
Yeah, that's the qualifier unionist. You'll see the 6th Tennessee, which was one of Joseph Cooper's. That was his regiment. And then he's the commander of the Tennessee State Guard during Reconstruction, but he was colonel of the 6th Tennessee. But you start having to put in parentheses Union,
Union.
whereas without that, it's assumed it's a Confederate unit. But so the Union side has to qualify and clarify, whereas the Confederates just, I'm the 6th Tennessee, so that means you're Confederate. It's a little subtle thing, but
But it's
but
important.
it is an important distinction. As far as the reconciliation is fascinating too. The war in memory. By the time you get to the 1890s, most of these veterans are old codgers now, and they're remembering the war, I guess, through a more romantic notion of fighting against a worthy opponent. This was a tough war, heavy casualties on all sides, and the causes of the war have faded. And it's sufficient that if you're a Northern soldier, it's sufficient that the Union was preserved and slavery was abolished. The all of the nastiness of Reconstruction, forget all that. Let's now at this point welcome my opponent as a brother in arms for having put up a worthy fight. Because it also, you can take pride, because the Confederates can do the same thing, that they put up a good fight, they fought a worthy opponent, and so you can share your war stories. If one side had completely shellacked the other, there's not going to be any mutual respect. It's going to be like, we kicked your ass. We're not going to have a little memorial reconciliation here. You were a loser. But both sides can recognize that at least on the battlefield their valor was equal, and I think that's a big part of these reunions and these reconciliation moments in the 1890s and early 1900s, where the cause of the war seems to have been forgotten. That the secession crisis is motivated by a defense of slavery. Okay, Reconstruction by this point has failed or been overthrown, and is no longer a relevant issue to most of them. And African Americans have been remanded to the status that most white Americans believe they deserve, a second class status,
Mm.
as farm labor. They're not slaves, so but they are also not fully equal, and the North
Acquiesced.
accepts that. They're fine with it. It's so I mean, my expertise is not the Civil War reunions, but that is a curious comment you make, Niels, that there's all of a sudden that if there is any kind of brotherhood, it comes many, many years later when you start having misty, romantic, glorious recollections of what you went through. And the last thing you want to say is it was terrible, or it was a failure, or it was fought in vain. Um, Instead, you focus on the heroism of it.
Well, on the flip side of that, um, you have the hatred of the ex-Confederates in Tennessee, of all of the radical uh, the radical process and radical agenda. I was thinking about Brownlow. I'm thinking about you talk about the enduring infamy of the Tennessee State Guard in your introduction. So from brotherhood and reconciliation, going way back, The enduring infamy of the Tennessee State Guard, I think, is a really great quote to describe how how Brownlow's political apparatus and his apparatus for the Reconstruction of Tennessee um, has been remembered or was
Yep.
forgotten or
Well, are being re-remembered.
yeah.
Yeah, he in the years after the the overthrow of Reconstruction in Tennessee, Brownlow is a vilified character. He is again, he's an irascible, acerbic individual. He doesn't he despises the secessionist mindset. Um, going into the Civil War, if I can remember the quote, he said that he would you know oh I hate one of these things where I got a quote at the tip of my tongue and then I can't fit it. Oh yeah, he
And,
said
but
he would.
but he's so quotable. There's so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, he said he would fight secession to the gates of hell, and then or he would fight secession till hell froze over, and then he would fight it on the ice. That's the quote. Fight secession till hell freezes over, and then fight it on the ice. Yeah, and he's at the forefront of the political reconstruction. Even as the Civil War is winding down, Tennessee's one of the first states to establish a loyal Republican government, to repudiate secession, to uh, abrogate the slave clauses. And Appomattox hasn't even happened. This all happens in the first months of 1865. And Brownlow's a very forceful character. Um, and he knows he's going to have to rule the state through authoritarian force. You cannot follow the niceties of constitutional democracy, even though you're trying to establish this. You have to make sure that the right people are in charge, and he'll be damned if the ex-Confederates ever get back in charge again, because that's who you fought against. That's the enemy, and so you disfranchise the ex-Confederates, and you disfranchise some of the conservative Unionists who aren't playing ball your way. And then to further bolster your numbers, Tennessee was the first state to enfranchise all of their adult black males after emancipation. This is before the 15th Amendment, which establishes universal manhood suffrage throughout the United States. Tennessee's really at the forefront, and it's not purely for idealistic reasons. It's, Brownlow and his followers understand that these are mechanisms that are necessary to ensure that they stay in power for the foreseeable future, to make sure that the traitors don't get back in charge, and that people who are of the unionist mindset can return to a normal, prosperous lifestyle. And he's very aggressive. He's We've talked about this already. He would really kind of like the Union Army, the federal garrison, to do the heavy lifting of law enforcement. But he comes around to the need for a militia force, and that William J. Smith, who the cover of the book, he's really at the forefront of saying, we need our own military force, to a statewide constabulary that we can rely on to enforce the laws. The sheriffs can't do it. The federal garrison doesn't want to do it. We need people that can make it happen. And Brownlow creates it, deploys it, and that to the enduring infamy, because this is all extra legal. If you're looking at it, if you don't take into account all of the circumstances behind what's going on in Reconstruction, and you look at it purely from the perspective of a ex-Confederate, this is pretty heavy-handed law enforcement. You've got Brownlow throwing out votes in counties where the outcome's not to his liking, forgetting, and that's because of the intimidation and fraud that was going on in those counties. And he's sending around militia companies, company here, company there, who are occupying communities and forcing curfews and going from house to house, confiscating weapons and making sure that African Americans can get to the polls on election day, and that ex-Confederates cannot, because they are going to try to vote illegally. So you've got this policing taking place, which
Well, it was already happening under the military governorship of Andrew Johnson as well.
Oh yeah, that very much during the war itself. Andrew Johnson ran politically ran the parts of Tennessee he had control over, like a
like a dictator.
yeah, a dictator. Well,
Well,
sure,
but it was a necessary war
but it
measure.
was necessary. And Brownlow takes on some of those qualities, these dictatorial qualities, despotic qualities. I try to qualify that and offer mitigating circumstances while acknowledging, yeah, this is not, you don't want this to be your normal mode of operations indefinitely, but in the short run, I considered it imperative if Reconstruction was going to work, you needed a forceful military body and a governor and a chief executive willing to make the hard call to suppress the civil liberties and rights and privileges of the defeated majority. Even President Grant, who when he unfortunately for Grant, he becomes in several years after the Reconstruction process has already been underway. But Grant, whose administration is often looked upon as a failure because of all of the
Corruption.
scandals and corruption, his Southern policy is actually pretty forward thinking. He very much wanted to protect African Americans. He wanted unionist governments under the Republican Party to work. And then in fits and starts, he would use the U.S. Army to try to enforce this. And after his presidency, when he was doing a world tour, people were interviewing him about among the conversations that would come up would be his view of Reconstruction, and he also agreed. He's prescient in the sense of he's anticipating historians like me by saying that a long-term military occupation was necessary. He looked back at it and said that you basically you had to kind of root out the rebel mindset, and that was going to take a generation, whatever that meant, in order for it to work. The problem is that Northern society and society in general um, was loath to accept the idea of a standing army maintaining police controls over a population for years on end. We don't want to live in that world, and so there wasn't enough will on the part of the Republican Party to maintain institutions like the State Guard, to have them in conducting occupation duty in a peacetime setting. I say peacetime, we've already talked about the lawlessness, the low-level civil war that's going on. But technically speaking, Tennessee's been readmitted to the Union. Its normal relations have been established. The Civil War is over, and so you cannot maintain an indefinite state of military occupation.
Martial law. Yeah.
Yeah, and Brownlow, he will declare martial law when the Klan gets out of hand in 1869. Brownlow declares martial law over 9 counties. He doesn't do it over the whole state, but he targets 9 counties, which were notorious for Klan activity, and then dispatches the state guard to suppress the Klan activities in those counties.
I think it's interesting that after his successor essentially lays down arms to uh, to the ex-Confederates, Brownlow's official portrait in the Capitol has to be removed
It's got
because
a lot of spit stains on it.
because of the tobacco spit.
Yeah. From his, I guess the
From the
trajectory
waist
of the
down.
spit couldn't hit him in the face because the portrait was too high.
Yeah,
But
so
from where his necktie is down, it's just
this nasty
this avalanche of a
tobacco spit.
cascade of tobacco juice. People
Oh, that would
spitting
be
at
rough.
it. Yeah,
Yes, apparently
Brownlow.
he's the only governor whose portrait is not in the Capitol, correct?
I I don't know about that
Uh,
now. There was a time when it was removed. It may have been, you
uh,
know,
I think it's still the case.
but
Obviously, somebody will correct us for.
yeah, given the current day reevaluation of whose image and statue and name should be where it is, Brownlow may have been rehabilitated. It's been a while since I've been back to Nashville to see that. But I'm gonna have to look into that to see if Brownlow has been rehabilitated and his portrait has returned, or
or
if
his portrait
even
has been,
now.
or his portrait has been re
Or yeah,
reproduce.
cleaned up. You got to leave the tobacco stains there. You keep it.
Memory's sake, yeah.
That's right. That's a whole history in itself. It's very telling.
Well,
Um,
There's a
so
label to be written.
I don't mean to dominate this whole conversation, Niels. I really don't. But I have a question about the makeup of this Tennessee State Guard.
mhm.
Who are the rank and file? Who are the leaders?
Yeah, I devote a lot of time to identifying all of the company commanders, and then I do in a couple of cases, I did some socioeconomic profiles of individual companies, selected companies. I couldn't do it for 2,000. In the 1867 deployment, there was about 1,900 members, and then the 1869 deployment, there's two separate deployments. There's about 1,600. The first deployment, most of the rank and file and the officers come from East Tennessee, but there's also a pretty generous mix of Middle and West Tennessee Unionists. Brownlow and then General Cooper, who runs it, as much as possible, wanted to draw on all of the Unionist enclaves. East Tennessee was the obvious one because that was heavy Unionist, but there were Unionists in Middle and West Tennessee who had been targeted and victimized by, um, you know, Confederate raids and operations. And so you're drawing on these men and the officers, the captains of the companies. Uh, in almost every case, they're Union Army veterans who have seen plenty of battle action, and so they have a lot of combat experience. And they're also accustomed to how chains of command work and the importance of training and discipline, which General Cooper insists upon. He doesn't want this to be a ragtag militia, motley crew, which the critics describe it as, a bunch of ragamuffins who are out of control. Cooper, he's very careful in who he and Brownlow selecting qualified officers. The rank and file themselves, a lot of them are mostly young farmers. Not all of the rank and file fought. Some of them are veterans. A lot of them are teenagers, well, they're like 17, 18, 19-year-old, but they
Yeah.
missed out on the war. And so militia service, it becomes an ersatz military experience for them. Big brother and daddy fought in the war. I missed out on it, but now I'm a member of the state guard, so I can, I got to put a uniform on. There's something exciting about it. But most of them are from the old yeoman class, which is a term used to describe um, white farmers who owned their own land but didn't own slaves. That's a term I have to always define for my students. When you use the word yeoman, is they are farmers, they're property holders, but they never owned slaves. A different kind of property. But an interesting element and a part of the story that I like to emphasize is that about 25% of the state guard, at least in the first deployment, were African Americans. Governor Brownlow and General Cooper uh, wanted to take advantage of the enthusiastic support that the newly enfranchised freedmen brought to the Republican Party and permit them an opportunity to share in the process of enforcing Reconstruction. And so you have about 500 African Americans that serve. For the most part, they're in segregated units. You've got, in most cases, if you have a company of African Americans, they're all black, um, sometimes under white officers, much like in the Civil War, the United States colored troops. You'd have black soldiers with white officers. But there is one company uh, in that was organized out of Middle Tennessee, which is made up of about 100 African Americans, and the officers are African American too. James Sumner is the captain. He had served in the United States colored troops during the war, and he is the officer in charge. So this is unique. Even though there are some racial misgivings on the part of the radicals about how much freedom they want to allow African Americans, there is this willingness to include them into the law enforcing body as militiamen. So you got about 500 African Americans, three African American officers
Hmm.
out of the entire officer corps, and they all perform very credibly. Uh, when I look at the Guard, they're deployed in 1867 to protect the state elections, and they patrol the countryside to roust out any leftover guerrilla bands. This is pre-Ku Klux Klan. You've still got a lot of local warlords and gang leaders who were former Confederates who want to stir up trouble and prevent blacks from registering to vote and to disrupt Republican Party meetings, the Union Leagues, as they were called. And then so the State Guard does a good job of protecting the political canvas, both the white and the black members of this whole thing. And then they protect the polls on the election day itself. There was concern when, however correct Brownlow was to recruit African Americans, this was risky. This was a controversial move on his part because there was all kinds of fears that it was bad enough from the ex-Confederate mindset that you've got these former Unionists, now militiamen, marching around, barking out orders, telling them what to do, and closing down the saloons on election day and this sort of thing. But to have African Americans in uniform, armed, especially a couple of officers walking around trying to do the same thing, the fear was if anything was going to incite a full-blown racial civil war, it would be the use of black militiamen. And so Governor Brownlow and General Cooper were very careful and judicious in how and where they deployed them and tended to monitor those units more closely. Not because they didn't think that Captain Sumner, for instance, was up to the task, but that they knew the gravity of the situation of sending, armed African Americans, many of whom were former slaves, into a community to police the politics of the region. This isn't just true for Tennessee. One sees this across the South. Republican governors very reluctant to use African Americans in a law enforcement capacity for fear of a race war that they were convinced would break out. It didn't happen in part because they never really pushed the experiment far enough to see if it would happen. But it's significant that there were African Americans in the Guard. And there was one unit, Company B, 1st Regiment under George Grisham, came out of East Tennessee. It was actually a racially mixed company. Most of the companies, if there are blacks, they're going to be segregated, but this was a racially mixed company, about 50-50 white black from East Tennessee, and I found that remarkable. The officers are white, but you've got black and white rank and file, camping together, marching together. Very, very unusual and an anomaly for its time.
What did any other states have that type of thing? Integrated militia units?
No, that's the only instance I could find of a militia unit anywhere in the Reconstruction South, and it's only one company.
Yeah, but still, it's an anecdotic, but it's still
yeah, but it's remarkable all the same. Other states, South Carolina actually had the largest militia formation. 20,000 African Americans served in the South Carolina militia, and it was almost all black. But it was rarely deployed because Governor Robert Scott in South Carolina was afraid that if he sent that many blacks into the countryside, that was definitely gonna reignite the Civil War. And so it was a powerful force on paper, but it was never really used to any meaningful effect. That's the state where President Grant ends up sending the U.S. cavalry in to fight the Ku Klux Klan. Because the governor, even though he had the sufficient manpower with 20,000 African Americans, he would not send them into the field. It's the states like Tennessee and Arkansas where the militias are mostly white, if not all white, that you see some aggressive use of the militia to suppress ex-Confederate activities. North Carolina was an example too. But where the militia units are heavily black, they are only timidly used. And this is not a statement at all about the quality of black militiamen. It's the lack of nerve on the part of the governors to use them for fear of a backlash that never happened because they never put the challenge to the test.
That before he keeps dominating. I, I kind of like thinking of like that in like two different ways. I was when you were talking that so there's part where it's sort of like this sort of see like what we saw during the Civil War was the irregular warfare, right? What we see in the West was Native American struggle, like how do you deal with sort of an elusive enemy that just blends back into like the farm or the city or disappears like as soon as you show up? And related to that, right? That I found it fascinating when every time your book gets to a point where it's like, oh, this county is very active and has a lot of like former Confederate activities, and the governor sends the militia, and whoopsie, it's all peaceful all of a sudden, right? And the militia withdraws, and it's like, crisis is back, and it's just it felt self-defeating, right? Like you send this body in, and it's like, oh, everything is blooming daisies. It's amazing, and people in Nashville are like, oh, it worked, great. Let's withdraw. Let's cut down the militia, and it's all good. And moments later, it's like back again. It's like it seems like you put a band-aid on and then you forget that, oh, the cut's still there.
It's a vicious paradox of when the militia shows up, as you quite rightly note, Niels, and I show this in several cases in the book.
Mhm.
There might be like a little kerfuffle here and there, but for the most part, the county or the community goes quiescent. The militia's shown up and everybody's on good behavior. And so then obviously, well, we didn't need to send the militia there after all. So let's get them out. Somebody's going to say, get them out of here. So you send them somewhere else, and then the troublemakers come up out of the woodwork, and you immediately need to send them back. So it's this tug of war. It's very frustrating. You're quite right. The enemy is elusive. Insurgencies historically are always very frustrating challenges for any military body to try to deal with, because the perpetrators, Klansmen or other paramilitary groups, they're not wearing their Confederate uniform anymore. They're intermixing. They live in the community, and they know everybody, and they know where to hide. They know how to put on a happy face for the moment, and then endure a week or 10 days of the militia bivouacked on the fairgrounds, and then when they leave, you go and beat up the voting registrar who's trying to sign up African Americans to vote, and you knock him around. So then the militia has to come back in, and back and forth it goes, which is why I make the case, and allude back to Grant and other radicals who said that the military presence needed to be more persistent and of longer duration. And an element that was important that the U.S. military discovered in fighting the Klan is you needed mounted sections. Too many of these militia units are infantrymen, and they come in by train and then they march in, and it's easy to get away from them. It's hard, but the mounted sections were some of the most effective, and I mentioned a couple of those. Captain Blackburn and Captain Rickman, and these guys had mounted sections, 25, 30 guys on horseback who could roam the countryside. You could get a bigger sweep through the countryside. You could go after troublemakers more effectively and run them to ground. This led to some of the few clashes between the state guard and the paramilitary forces. But the mounted sections were the more effective ones because they had mobility, and that's what the U.S. cavalry discovered when they fought the Klan. That's one reason you mentioned the frontier battles. Uh, Infantrymen are not going to defeat the Plains Indians marching around, the tens of thousands of square miles out there. You needed fast-moving detachments of cavalry to make it happen, and that was a logistical or technological, is not the right word when you talk about a horse, element that's missing from the state guard. They didn't have a mounted wing, um, but even so, it's frustrating. It's elusive. Uh, Joseph Cooper, the general, what he really wanted was to leave detachments, of 40, 50 guys in a county for weeks and months. But all that would do is the anti-radical newspapers would then denigrate and say, look at this martial law, despotic government, disrupting the lives of peaceable citizens. And as you pointed out, Niels, there's no troublemaking going on. So it's like, what are they doing here? And so then they leave, and then bam, we're back at it again, which is exactly what happened when the Ku Klux Klan deployment in 1869. 1868, there was no militia. After 1867, the militia's deployed to protect the election. The election passes off. Brownlow wins. The radicals have won. So then you disband the state guard. 1868, the Ku Klux Klan comes into full power, full scope. Lynchings, burnings, attacks, disruption. The U.S. Army plays a more active role that year, but as I've already pointed out, their approach is hesitant and reluctant most of the time. So then you bring the Klan back in 18, or you bring the state guard back in 1869. That's when martial law is declared, and you get this brief period in the spring of 1869 where everything's quiet again. The Klan, Nathan Bedford Forrest, the nominal leader of the Klan, the fearsome cavalry raider of the Civil War fame, he tells the Klan, go underground. I mean, just don't engage. Because one, if you engage the militia, you're probably going to lose because they've got more firepower and they're better organized. And it's also going to give the radicals the victories and the proof that they need to demonstrate that there really is a Klan menace that needs to be put down. So you just steer clear. I make the point that that battle avoidance for someone like Nathan Bedford Forrest, who loved to fight, his decision to avoid battle is actually the smart move. Because now the militia's marching around and it looks like overkill, and they disband again. This is when, Andrew, you were talking about at this point, Brownlow gives way to Governor Center, his replacement, who's less vigorous than Brownlow. The militia's disbanded, the Klan returns, and by 1870, the Democrats have regained control in the state, and the Republicans have lost out. When they're there, there's no problem. When they're not there, there's a problem. But again, I'm also fascinated by that paradox. You see it, uh, a project of mine that's never going to come to fruition, but I've sometimes thought about it, is comparing the Reconstruction South with Weimar Germany after World War I, which is another government that's struggling to come into its own, and it's marred by all these Freikorps paramilitary movements, which eventually include the Nazis, who are disrupting everything at the local level, and the Weimar Republic's never able to establish itself. Because the Reichswehr, the army under it, did not have the will or the desire to go crush out these Freikorps movements. That's not that was something that's always in the back of my mind. I'd have to polish up my German, which is really bad, to get into those sources, and I don't think it'll ever happen. But I've often thought a global comparison between Reconstruction South and Weimar Germany, both of them coming after wars where the losing side refuses to acknowledge the outcome and stirs up trouble. There's some interesting parallels there.
You just took me back to my work. Because I have a wonderful student who is working on her, she's doing her IB diploma program in one of the classes of history, and one of the topics they're looking at is authoritarian governments, and Hitler's Germany and Mao is two of the
Oh, wow.
topics that they were looking at. And we had an hour and a half long conversations the other day in the studio about like the historiography related to Weimar and the lack of support that people showed to Weimar. So
Yeah.
I will now make her listen to this and find this moment.
Yeah, let her do that comparison.
Yes.
That's a pipe dream of mine. I'm never going to get around to it.
Yeah.
But I'm intrigued by your book now that just came out, because I sometimes get caught up into the local, narrowly focused aspects of history that it's important to step back and put it in a larger context and see global parallels and connections where otherwise, you just think the Civil War is the be all end all and you forget there's a lot more going on out there.
And arguably, it was of the chapters, I forget how many we have, 11 chapters, I think, are in the book. Reconstruction was the hardest chapter to write. I wanted a reconstruction. I sort of insisted to Duncan that we should have a reconstruction chapter in there, but it's like, because there's so little, it's hard to make global comparisons, right?
Yeah.
Because like there's hardly anything written per se on kind of transnationally or comparatively thinking about Reconstruction. And then there's very little that is sort of in a easy to digest frame with regard to Reconstruction because it's so complex, it makes it really hard. So it was a it was a very tough chapter to write, I felt.
Not just for you, but as we pointed out, that it's not the most exciting. To me, it's exciting. There's endless fascination and
Oh yeah.
excitement if you dig into the topic, but it just sort of seems like this confusing mishmash of political power struggles, and it's a lot easier to just look at Pickett's charge
Yeah.
than to try to figure out what's going on in the backwoods of Tennessee.
The problem that I have with Reconstruction is that the more you dig, the more complex it becomes.
Mhm.
Um,
Doesn't get any easier.
No, and I think we all know as scholars that the more you learn, the more you realize there's
yeah.
a whole lot out there that I don't know about, and the importance of connecting so many of these
Mm.
more focused microcosmic studies. The macro is important. You've got to have the big Eric Foner's big reconstruction, or American history, or world history, but it needs to connect. You also have to get into the minutia to fully appreciate it.
I have
And
two
that
more questions that I
okay.
want to ask. And I saw Andrew is yawning, so we're approaching, I guess, his bedtime
Not
slowly.
meaning to, okay. Remember, I haven't been back for 24. It's been 20 hours since I returned from Germany
Oh, well,
with my kids.
it's been 20, I don't know how many, 28 hours since I brought home a baby.
All right, you win.
A- And it's been 34 years since I was in Germany. I was
Okay, I
in
was thinking you were going to
Oberammergau.
bring up like an Alabama defeat, an
Yeah.
Auburn reference.
Going very briefly, when I was in the Army Chemical Corps, I went to a NATO NBC, that's Nuclear Biological Chemical Warfare School in Bavaria. It was near Oberammergau, and
Ooh.
I spent more time drinking beer and taking in the countryside than learning anything from the NATO school. I don't remember much of what the classroom was like, but I sure remember the gorgeous German countryside and Hefeweizen and all of that.
There we go. There was the advertisement for Germany again. At
Schloss
least there
Linderhof,
weren't
there's another one, yeah.
at least there weren't Lados involved. That's a step forward. Um, no, in part I kind of wondered because yeah, I think because I read the dissertation, so Andrew can correct based on what was in the book. I think in the dissertation you still refer to it as the Memphis riot. And these days there's some activists in Memphis that want to call it rather the Memphis massacre. And I kind of wondered what kind of are your thoughts on this as sort of I guess sort of the transition between the Civil War as sort of a period of fighting and then the kind of this internal civil war within Tennessee, between these various groups trying to vie for power.
It, Memphis, I may have just referred to it as the race riot. It is a massacre. For those who aren't familiar with it, um, May 1866, the white community in Memphis rampages through the black neighborhoods and At least 46 African Americans are killed. Dozens of buildings, homes, dwellings, churches, schools are burned to the ground. It's a terrible, tragic event. That's a subset of the larger Reconstruction story. The political dimensions are not as noteworthy. It's the racial component. At the end of the Civil War, when African Americans are freed, first by the Emancipation Proclamation, then the 13th Amendment. Uh, African Americans they went to the urban areas looking for jobs. They wanted to get off the plantation, get away from the old gang labor, field hand work, and find different livelihoods. And so Memphis's population, I think, quadrupled within like a 1 year, 18-month period right at the end of the war. And you had the black population in particular, I think, quadrupled. Yeah, or maybe I already used that that factor. Anyway, you have a big population boom, the bulk of which is African Americans moving in to Memphis, and this greatly disrupts and disturbs the racial status quo that had been there prior to the war. Many of the African Americans were former soldiers as well, who often walked around in their old uniforms. They've been disarmed, they've been mustered out, they don't have their weapon, but they wear their uniform. All of this is provocative, and a clash on the street where whites are expecting blacks to kind of submit and show subservience. These African American soldiers, they're proud defenders of the Union and self-emancipators. They're like, up yours. And this produces a confrontation which spirals into a citywide conflagration. It's a riot, a one-sided riot. African Americans at first wanted to fight. Many of them went into the nearby Union fort in the area. They took refuge there. They wanted their weapons back. The Union garrison's like, no, we're not giving you your weapons, and so they were defenseless against the white mob, made up of a lot of Irish. I don't know. I don't want to pick on the Irish, but the New York City draft riots were the Irish during the Civil War. Um, but to kind of encapsulate this whole story, it's a racial confrontation between long-term white residents in Memphis who resent the arrival of so many African Americans, many of whom are asserting their rights. The term uppity gets used. A black person that stands up for themselves and has self-respect is somehow this is a challenge to white authority, and this triggered the conflagration that followed. The city police, to the extent that they did anything, often aided and abetted the rioters or looked the other way. After a couple of days, finally, that U.S. garrison got orders from higher headquarters to restore order, and they went out and they put an end to it, but not before the black community had been totally gutted.
Churches burned, houses, women raped.
Yeah, there was at least 5 rapes of African American women, 46 killed at least. Some of these are the official estimates. One could probably dig around and find even more corpses, unfortunately. But yeah, the residences, churches, some of the
schools too, I
yeah,
think.
schools, some of the storefronts, African Americans that had opened up barber shops or were running their own saloons and restaurants. These were all destroyed.
Well, anything that symbolized black people showing their place in society,
Yeah.
a new place in society.
Yeah, black independence. All of those are symbols. The church, the schools, businesses. They're torched, and it's a tragedy. It's a byproduct of emancipation and the outcome of the war. The white population still angry, being on the losing side, and then here come all these African Americans. And again, there's the psychological dimension that I've already mentioned, that I've talked about. I'm not trying to justify this or condone it, but I try to understand it from the standpoint that these white Southerners, they're psychologically accustomed to seeing blacks as inferiors, and without justifying their violence, they really can't tolerate this.
Not moving off the sidewalk when they.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the black codes are formulating in many of the southern states, which is, I call it, like a harbinger of what becomes apartheid in South Africa.
Yeah.
Is the white South is trying to impose these racial regulatory laws. Those are in the process of going through some of the state, not in Tennessee. There's no black codes there because the radicals control things from the outset. But in other states, you've got black codes. But the Memphis race riot is a grossly highlights the racial animosity. There's animosity between Unionists and ex-Confederates, and there's just as deep animosity between white and black during the Reconstruction years. Yeah, Memphis is a terrible story. It does lead. I don't really talk much about it in my book. I'm focusing on the Tennessee State Guard, but another law enforcement element that Governor Brownlow introduced was the creation of metropolitan police forces. Um, this predated the state guard. Was he wanted to create a police force controlled by the governor in the three big cities, Memphis, Nashville, Chattanooga, and these would be hand-picked um, deputies, constables, policemen who wouldn't follow the orders of the mayor. They would follow the orders of the governor, which is another one of these constitutionally irregular approaches to running Reconstruction. And in the wake of the Memphis race riot, the Metropolitan Police Act was passed, and a police force that was pro-Republican was set up in Memphis that replaced the police force that had looked the other way during the Memphis riot.
So
You have one in Nashville, and then there's one uh,
Chattanooga.
and in Chattanooga.
Hmm.
So at what point maybe this is your question, Niels. I was looking at my shelf. University of Georgia a few years ago published a book called "Remembering the Memphis Massacre."
Hmm.
I mean, 3 or 4 years ago. It's not very old. At what point did the terminology shift from race riot to massacre, or has the idea of a massacre always been there?
Is that for
That was
Niels?
a question I was
Oh,
just asking anybody.
I don't know.
Anybody who wants to answer.
I think
I don't mean to go off camera. I'm trying to find uh,
I
my
seem to remember that it was like popular wise, it was a big push when the
sorry.
150th anniversary took place, and they did a lot of efforts in the community, and that was sort of when they started to, from a popular perspective, reevaluate the name. And I think that's what you saw with that book as sort of a effort to re-sing it. But I
Yeah,
don't know
because
if in the
because
African American community it was already called that.
oh well, yeah, because I think the Athens book is from 2016, 2017.
Mhm.
It's right about the 150th.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's important terminology. There's definitely a riot, and it's racial riot, but it's one-sided. Most of the riots during the Reconstruction years are very one-sided, lopsided, where it's mostly African Americans are the ones getting killed. New Orleans has one
Yeah.
just a few months after Memphis, where like 3 dozen African Americans are killed. It was Georges Clemenceau, speaking, you might know
Yeah,
him, Andrew, as the
yeah, of
the
course. Yeah,
tiger of the.
yeah.
He was actually a French correspondent from the first 5 years during Reconstruction. He was traveling the United States and writing reports back home to his newspaper, which all these became part of a book where he's observing Reconstruction. He made the point. He said, "It's funny, all these race riots, it's always blacks getting killed, and no whites seem to get killed in these things." And he was saying that sarcastically.
Sure.
Um, but yeah, massacre, riot. It's like in a different context. We used to refer to the when the United States acquires the Philippines after the Spanish-American War and the Filipinos rise up against U.S. occupation. It's called the Philippine Insurrection. It's now just the Philippine-American War, because insurrection makes it sound like an unlawful uprising against a legitimate government. And from the Filipino standpoint, the United States was not the
Yeah.
legitimate governing authority over them. So But yeah, terminology, it's important, and
Certainly
it's
important.
always worth revisiting how we use words um, to get to a more accurate, more balanced understanding of what actually happened. But yes, in my book I called it a riot, and I was sticking with the conventional description, but
It wasn't a
it's def
criticism.
yeah, well, but
Yeah.
it's worth bringing up. It's definitely a massacre, and that is the operative word when one thinks about uh, Memphis.
And for me as a final, I'll let Andrew have the final question. Final question. I'll insist on a final question from him. Since he sometimes likes to make the final, like into 5 different parts.
No,
The multi-part final question.
Yeah.
my brain is not.
That,
I
that's
don't think it's working correctly.
that's what
So
all of us historians do. That we can never give a simple, straightforward answer to anything, or ask just one question. Yeah,
Well, we'll see what do you think about this one. So I kind of was like, because you kind of in a number of places in the dissertation, I assume in the book as well, sort of point to a bit of, but you never explore sort of counterfactual, right? Of like what could have been the situation. And I kind of wondered if you could, if you want to sing mo briefly about like how could have Tennessee's Reconstruction experiment been different had there been a Tennessee state militia for like more years, or for the entirety of Reconstruction, or for just like another, like instead of being dismissed for what was it, 68, it had would have been there 68, 69, 70, would have,
yeah.
how would have that looked different?
I I do in my conclusion. I don't know if I did this in my dissertation. I know I have it in the book, where I hypothesize briefly what a longer term commitment to the State Guard could have done, and I actually advocate for this in my conclusion, that because the State Guard, when it was deployed, was effective, why not a better way of approaching it would have been perhaps a smaller state guard instead of 2,000 men. Perhaps identify your most capable captains and disciplined soldiers, and create 4 or 5 companies mounted, and have them kind of operating on a rotating basis throughout Middle and West Tennessee, where they don't stay in any area for too long, but that their presence is always in motion, and they can quickly get back to an area if, as we've pointed out, Klansmen or whoever stir up trouble again, they can quickly get back to the trouble spot. But that they're constantly in motion, a ready reserve at the beck and call of the governor. And for 1867, keep it in 1868, 1869. I'm not saying that this is a guarantee that the radicals will stay in power, but it's certainly a better option than the one they ended up taking. We know they fell from power, and that's in large part because the paramilitary forces simply outlasted the will of the Republican government to maintain a military presence. And I think a longer term deployment of a smaller but more elite uh, uh, selected group of state guardsmen could have produced uh, better results, and that had this been emulated in other parts of the South, you might have been able to quell the insurgency. Again, this is all hypothetical. There's no way to know for sure, but when we look back at what actually happened, and we try to figure out how could things have unfolded differently, a more consistent and effective use of the politics of force through the specific instrument of a state militia, I think would have better served the interests of the Reconstruction program in the South, and given it a chance to succeed. But as I point out, it was the matter of expense. Uh, These are this, I think the $500,000 was what the State Guard ended up costing, and none of these governments have a lot of money to begin with. So this is an expensive dispersal. There's the concern about race war, but if it's an all-white militia force, you perhaps obviate or abnegate the idea of a race war. But then there's this issue of political legitimacy, which should never be overlooked. That a government that has to uh, maintain power through bayonet rule is one that's going to have a difficult time persuading society that they are the
Legitimate.
justified leader. And so the longer this goes, the harder it is to make the case that you're a legitimate government that's upholding Republican principles and the democratic process, except we're not. Because it's because we have to keep you at bay. And the North is, if you look at the bigger Reconstruction story, by 1870, Northern society's done with Reconstruction. It's still going on in lots of the South, but the Northern society is like, okay, we've passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Blacks have their
Millions.
rights. The states have been readmitted. We don't care anymore. Figure it out. And when the Northern society throws in the towel, the federal government no longer has the imprimatur to intervene, and these Southern Republicans are left to their own devices, and they just don't have the capacity to hold on.
Okay, so all right, I have two questions. One is practical,
Okay.
and we'll get to the second one if it's okay. So we were talking about in your conclusion, you're talking about having kind of a select elite group of mounted troops, kind of traveling the countryside, maintaining order. But in terms of practicality, in reality, where were the different when the militia was when it was called into service, when it was mobilized, right, 67 and 1869? Where were the different companies garrisoned? Were there forts? Were there garrison cities? Were they based in Nashville? How did they travel?
There are no forts that there are U.S. military installations in the big cities, Nashville and Memphis, but the State Guard doesn't use those. They set up campgrounds. They'll bivouac in places. A lot of times towns have a fairground, and the militia would simply take that over and set up their tents and have these kind of ad hoc little headquarters would be set up.
Hmm.
They're not really using homes or installations. They're setting up their own encampments. They do that especially in the 1869 deployment, where 3 sections of the state are placed under martial law, and then the militia would go set up kind of a permanent encampment. They stay, but it is like a tent city, a tent
Yeah.
ground.
Hmm.
And those that don't have horseback to travel around, they made use of the railroads, and the General Cooper and the Brownlow administration set up a pretty reasonable arrangement with the railroad companies to give discounts and to the State Guard and priority in times of crisis to move companies around to various trouble spots. And then when they would get to an area, they would disembark, and they would usually march to the fairgrounds and set up, and then they would conduct street patrols or do it or protect the polling places or whatever they needed to do. So it's a lot of improvisation in terms of how they operate in the field.
And this is only possible after Brownlow is able to rebuild part of the infrastructure that was destroyed during the war
Yeah.
over the course of occupation, over the course of
Yeah, the railroads get a pretty early emphasis. You want to get those up and running as quick as you can, and not just for the Brownlow, but anyone interested in economic.
yeah.
Uh, Everybody's going to want the railroads functioning, not just to move militia troops around, but to cotton and it and the North everybody wants the railroads functioning. So those were rebuilt pretty quickly as the Civil War wound down. And frankly, they were rebuilt very quickly during the war. This has nothing to do with my book, but usually when Confederate raiders destroyed railroad tracks, the Union's rail system under Herman Haupt and others, they were able to get those rails rebuilt within 48 hours
Yeah.
and functioning
They had
again.
they had the models of the bridges, and they were able to
Yeah.
put them back together like Legos.
Those trestles, they just put them in place. Prefab bridges and rail lines. So the rail system is functioning pretty quickly at the end of the war. The rest of the farmlands, all this is derelict and torn up, and their local communities are still, you can still see the detritus of war. But the rail system's working pretty well. But as far as, but yeah, the state guard, they're figuring out as they go. That's another aspect about counterinsurgency is this was most Americans didn't have a lot of experience with this sort of thing, and so you know the state guard and the U.S. Army, for that matter, they're in uncharted waters in how to pacify an unhappy and restless population.
Okay, so then the less practical of the questions, I guess. So I look a lot at Andrew Johnson. He's the focus of my own thesis.
Okay.
And Brownlow and Andrew Johnson have had they had their ups and downs. My question actually is about Brownlow's administration and presidential reconstruction. Did Andrew Johnson's handling of the post-Civil War South have any impact on Brownlow's plans for reconstructing Tennessee? It was a bad question.
Well, I mean, Andrew Johnson, well, first of all, the two men, they're both East Tennessee Unionists. So they're like-minded during the secession crisis. They hate secession. They hate the Confederacy. Um, but and then as the war goes on, they're okay with the dismantling of the institution of slavery. And you pointed out Andrew Johnson was the military governor of Tennessee, and he ran it like a dictator. And Brownlow follows suit as governor. But the falling out occurs early on in Reconstruction when Andrew Johnson becomes opposed to the Republican Party's agenda of a hard Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson wants certainly the South to repudiate secession and emancipate the slaves, but after that, handling of race relations is a state right matter, states' rights issue, and he doesn't want to have anything to do with it, and he wants to, remove the army. He's a virulent racist. Andrew Johnson doesn't like slavery, but he also doesn't like
Doesn't
black
like black
people.
people.
Yeah, and Brownlow doesn't like slavery, and he's kind of blacks. He's kind of indifferent to their individual aspirations, so they do share that. But where they differ is Brownlow very much wants to punish the traitorous ex-Confederate element, which Andrew Johnson at one point had said he wanted to do. Treason must be made odious,
Yeah.
and traitors must be punished. But he softens, and he begins to try to establish political rapport or rapprochement rather with the defeated white South as Reconstruction unfolds, and he becomes a bulwark against the radical Republican agenda at the national level. And that's and Brownlow's lining up with the radical Republican element. The influence of Johnson over Tennessee itself is limited because Tennessee is readmitted to the Union very quickly. They kind of a step back to be Johnson's restoration policy was you ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, you repudiate secession, then you come back into the Union like nothing happened. We'll just go back to the way things were, status quo. The Republicans in 1866, when they gain a majority, some of this is coming out of the Memphis Massacre, where they win more seats in Congress and now have a veto-proof majority in Congress, they take over the Reconstruction process, and their requirement is in order for a Southern state, a Confederate state, to be brought back into the Union, you also have to ratify the 14th Amendment. This is the one that creates biracial citizenship and invalidates all of those black codes. Johnson's opposed to that. Brownlow's in favor of it. Brownlow ensures that Tennessee ratifies the 14th Amendment. They're the only Confederate state to voluntarily ratify the 14th Amendment. The other states were forced to do it, which produces all sorts of constitutional irregularities where you're going to vote for this, you have to, or we're going to punish you. But anyway, Tennessee comes back in, and so they do not fall under the Military Reconstruction Acts of 1867. And so the federal government's direct involvement in Tennessee affairs is limited because Tennessee came back into the Union, and so they essentially have normal relations again. And the president has about as much influence over Tennessee as he has over Ohio or New York or Maine. And Brownlow is very comfortable with that, especially since
Yeah.
he's at odds with Johnson's vision. And so he takes a page out of the old states' rights concept. I'm the governor of the state. I'll run things my way. Now I'll call on the federal garrison to help out sometimes, and hopefully they will. But other than that, I don't need anything from President Johnson. And Johnson is handcuffed. He can't really intervene on principle. He doesn't want to because he wants the states to run things. Um, but then he's also rebuffed by Brownlow. So it's again, this is where we get into different reconstructions. Tennessee is an unusual case because they don't come under the Military Reconstruction Acts, and they have a very strong radical unionist white Republican element that helps run that state. So Johnson's influence is he's there. He offers moral encouragement to the ex-Confederate majority. Yeah, you should resist, but he doesn't really take a direct hand in it.
I just wonder if Brownlow at some point in time would have seen himself as you know what, up yours, Andrew Johnson. Look what we're going to do here in Tennessee.
Yeah, that's the mentality. I mean, there's no great letter where he gives the middle
Uh,
finger to Washington D.C. or to Johnson, but that's essentially what he's doing, and that's his nature too. He did that.
Provocateur,
That
yeah.
was just that was just his approach to everything. Both of them are they have a nasty side to them, and they're not afraid to get into the dirt. But for Johnson, it's he's really not in a position to do much in Tennessee.
Yeah. That was my last question, Niels.
All right. And I think we are at an almost record, almost 2 hours for
Well,
the interview at this point. So I think for all of us, we are going to end here. Again, thank you so much, Ben, for joining us. And the book we discussed today was Tennessee's Radical Army, the State Guard, and its Role in Reconstruction, which came out with University of Tennessee Press in 2005. But Ben has also published A War State All Over, Alabama Politics and the Confederate Cause with University of Alabama Press in 2020. So he's been a very prolific author with regard to Civil War era history.
Yeah, it was a delight to revisit this topic with you all. I'm glad you contacted me. I'm honored by the invitation. The last several years I've been immersed in Alabama's story in the Civil War era, and so it was nice to go back to my original passion, the Tennessee story of Reconstruction. So much appreciated to just share my thoughts and enjoy this conversation.
It was a really it was a great exchange. I really enjoyed myself.
I enjoyed it too. Thanks.
Thank you.